one of the things that I think is really important when you start doing forensic cases is figuring out a focus. Okay? So, do you want fingerprints to be crap? Do you want this fingerprint to be insignificant because it's of no consequence, like the one on the front door? Or, like Jason did, the truth is jurors don't want to believe fingerprints are crap. They want to believe this stuff is good. So here we have a situation with a witness who isn't keeping up on these great government programs, right? We've got the IAI, we've got SWIG-FAST, which is FBI-sponsored or NIJ-sponsored. I'm not sure which. I'd have to look that up, right? But the government pays for these people to fly to a single location and meet for days to come up with best practices and policies and to discuss and take testimony and things like that. So what he does is he takes all that is good and beautiful about fingerprints and establishes she doesn't have it. Now, her response about training being the first thing to cut, that's fair enough for the last year. Maybe for the last 3 years, okay? But for the last 47 years, no. All right? And frankly, this year IA is in Milwaukee. So anyone, if she's in Chicago, she can drive to Milwaukee and go to that conference, right? She doesn't have to necessarily have her boss pay for it. There are people at my crime lab who take vacation days to go to IAI. So, so his decision, all right, this is a good science, fine, I'm going to leave that alone, but I'm going to attack these pieces. The other thing is it was real obvious that Jason got the underlying file, right? Because you didn't see in your fingerprint report how big of an area it was.
You did.
Did you see that?
Just the upper core.
The upper core, okay.
I mean, I didn't have the actual piece of paper, but that's what I used that on.
Okay, so you have to learn some words, right, like core. And these things here that Jason did, you can read about this easily enough. And this point that he made about, well, the top of that looks the same as maybe the top of that, and you don't have any additional information, you can translate that in DNA cases where you have a partial profile or a messy mixture, and into some other cases, and because he drew it, it's not he and the scientist having a private conversation. The jury can see it. Didn't it make sense to all of you? When he was drawing it, I didn't know if he was just sort of giving general education or what, but when he got to the punchline, it's like, oh, okay. Easy to understand language. So that's my initial, and you did a great job too as a prosecutor. I was kind of creeped out by it though, I have to tell you. Great prosecutor.
I'll just say a few things following up. I'm glad you got the point I think, going in and saying all fingerprints are junk, which is what the tape running?
Yeah.
Okay, which the NAF says is true, that all fingerprints anywhere are junk. That's for the pretrial motions hearing. I think once you get to trial, it's got to be, they're too ingrained, at least right now, it's got to be fingerprints are fine, this analyst did it wrong. And this analyst made mistakes and didn't document and whatever else you can get. You can do that, there's maybe a question on redirect about ACE-V, we're painting ACE-V as this terrible thing through the NAS report, and I would have done more with more time. She's going to say everybody uses ACE-V. You don't know exactly what everyone's doing or how they're doing it. And the reality is that ACE-V is and it's in the NAS report, the ACE-V is so broad and non-specific that, two people can do completely different processes and both call them ACE-V. So I think that's one of the most important points is, and I've been burned on this one in forensic cases, I've been like, all of DNA is hocus pocus, witch doctor, blah, 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 and that we lost in 3 hours. So I think the science is, the trial strategy often is, not always, the science is okay, but this person isn't doing it right. The other thing is that, we got into some of this stuff with last week at your office, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to reiterate what was said the first day, I think it was by Mike. You got to go, if you're going to cross, you got to go to the office and see what's going on, right? You got to meet the person, you got to ask these questions. I wouldn't ask these questions if I knew some of this Red Book Fingerprint Digest stuff was going to come out on me, so that was nicely done. Even then they can lie to you, but it's a little harder. It's a little harder for them. And then also you see that these places are not labs, right? So we tried, I hope I was able to do that. I didn't do as well as I wanted, but this is not a lab. This idea this is a lab where they do science is nonsense. And there are other pieces of that we didn't get to about, it's subjective and it's just your opinion and it's not like a breathalyzer where a chemical reaction spits out a number and it's all mathematical. I indulged myself a little bit. I apologize. The James Newsom thing is actually true, right? So if you went and looked in Chicago, the Chicago Fingerprint Unit didn't run something in APHIS, right? And I think in closing, you can go apeshit in closing on any of this stuff that they didn't do. Didn't write down stuff, didn't document stuff, didn't check other people, didn't run it in APHIS. And any of this stuff, but we don't have the ability, we don't have the money, we don't have the whatever. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you decide how much you need, right? You decide. And if they're having budget cuts and whatever, that doesn't change the Constitution, right? It's not Mr. McVader's fault. He doesn't get less constitutional rights because some bureaucrat decided to cut some training, right? They still have to have that high level of beyond reasonable doubt. And in a criminal case, especially in a lot of these fingerprint cases, they're not going to, sometimes they'll have the pictures, but if they don't have the pictures of the documentation, it's really, this is a goddamn criminal case. This is not trust me, right? This is show me, prove it, bring it in. I want to see it, touch it, feel it. You are the jury. That's your job. Prosecutor came in and said, he's guilty, let's go vote. He'd vote not guilty in a second. The fingerprint examiner comes in, trust me, it's consistent with or whatever. That's not enough. They got to show it, ladies and gentlemen, right? And I think a real strong, indignant closing is a good match with a lot of this lack of work that they're doing. And there's a bunch of other stuff that Tamar had given me to cross on, and I apologize I didn't get to. I'm sure it came up in your small groups. Didn't go to the scene, didn't know the method of lift, what the surface was like, didn't talk to the people there. SWIGFAST has recommendations. In order to do the first step of ACE-V, you got to know what it came from. You got to take a look at it. You got to see what the substance is. You've got a whole list of things that you can get. You didn't do this, you didn't do that, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. That's what SWIGFAST, the experts, say you should do, right? So that's just making up for the pieces of cross I didn't get to. Sorry.
The only thing that I would say is that the overall goal of the demonstration was for there to be a direct examination that presents the science as infallible, and presents these conclusions as sacrosanct. And then for you to see Jason, based on his knowledge of the science, unpack what really happened. And I thought that the cross-examination, the 150 points, and how there's only 15 matches, and how that means there's 135 that we didn't even look at, that could potentially be points of difference. That sort of thing is very powerful. Without knowing the science, you will not be able to conduct that cross-examination, and you'll be left with the type of direct examination that ends with the witness saying, it's a dead-on match, it's McFadder, it couldn't be anyone else. And the jury, unless you do this work, will believe that. They will believe that testimony unless you raise the doubts that Jason was able to raise based on his knowledge of the science.
And some of the things, like, you got to check with your examiner. They should give you 100. They should give you 100 to 150. But you got to check. I mean, the week before, you can't just ask that question cold and they'll be like, no, there's only 20, right? Because you're hanging out there. You're not going to be able to fix it in time. So you just ask casually, oh, how many? If I had my whole finger, how many points would that be? Or what they're going to say about some loop whorls. Marvin, you had something?
Yeah, I assumed in this demonstration we lost all the pre-trial motions to challenge.
Right.
Yes.
And we lost the application to limit the statements by the expert that this is a science, or any reference by the prosecutor that this is a science. You can lose the entire pre-trial motion to challenge, but get judges to agree that we are not going to call this a science. In which case, it gets very subtle, because the first mention of science by Michael on direct, saying this is a science, that's a form of vouching. And if you've got a judge who says, all right, Schechter, I'm denying your motion, but I don't want anybody in this courtroom saying it's a science. And then the prosecutor gets up and says, now tell me, madam, is this in the science of fingerprinting? And then you get up and object. Right? You do the sidebar. And the prosecutor says to the judge, oh, I thought you meant the witness, not me. Right? Right? This is the
I like
old,
to testify.
this is the old motion and limiting game, where we win the motion and limiting, but the devil is in the details. So if we win some kind of exclusion, we lose it. We can't challenge it. And Jason's right. Once you're at the trial, we're into the whole shebang. But if we win small portions, you've got to make sure that the prosecutor understands. And I asked for a complete summary of the ruling, but the judge makes it so that it's clear that the prosecutor, when he gets up to do the direct, he cannot say that subtle little statement. Tell me about the science and fingerprint. That's really important.
Right, and
And there's case law about that. It's in the tool mark area, but there is a trend towards finally limiting testimony. And you mentioned that case yesterday. It's just the town. It's that federal case with the.
Smallwood,
No, it really does start with no.
the state of Michigan versus Jabraki, that's the blood alcohol.
No, it's
Malzone.
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 Thank you.
Yeah. There's
Yeah.
actually some fingerprint cases now
Yeah.
where the judge says, no one is going to say science. No one can even talk about fingerprints being unique. No one can say fingerprints are permanent. But we lost the pretrial challenge.
Right.
But the judge said those things count. I don't want to hear that in my courtroom. So, but when you say that, it doesn't just apply to the witness; it applies to the prosecutor.
So just to make sure I'm not being unclear, I think fingerprints are so ingrained that you sort of have to say fingerprints are fine and this person sucks. For other stuff, we've talked about tire track and shoe print. A broader attack on the whole thing is junk and this person's an idiot. I think is depending on the case, is certainly the way to go.
The importance, Marvin's point is important because if you haven't challenged pre-trial, just think about the way trials play out. If he doesn't have that pre-trial ruling that the prosecutor and the witness are concluded from referring to fingerprint comparison as a science, when you stand up on your feet and make that objection for the first time during the trial, it will be received differently by the judge than if you're objecting and moving for him to enforce a pretrial ruling. You're going to get a totally different response just based on what the judges are dealing with practically. There's a jury in the box. This is an issue that you haven't raised before, and it's something that may require the judge to actually think about it. And oftentimes it's tougher to get a judge to focus on that type of objection on the spot than it is if you're raising a pretrial.
And also then, if you raise a pretrial, it gives you the opportunity to have a discussion with the judge about why it is that you want it. You're not getting that in the middle of the trial.
And to ask the type of follow-up clarification questions about the ruling, really. So you can lose, that's what's critical. You can lose the overall motion, but the judge might give you a few things, might give you some limitations, at least oftentimes will force the prosecutor to make some sort of a proffer, and then you can start to talk about the proffer. And it's if you think about it, just the way these things play out, a prosecutor could have presented this type of testimony 100 times, and if this is the first case in which they've been told not to use the word science, it doesn't have to be something intentional. It can be completely inadvertent that they use the term science, but now you're in a position where, regardless of intent, the pretrial ruling has been violated, and that pretrial ruling is based on your client's rights.
That could never happen like in a baseball case, really. You put the wrong thing up on the screen even though you were told not to. For example, and it leads to a mistrial. So whose credibility gets destroyed by violation of the pretrial ruling? Not yours. So you've lost the pretrial ruling. You won a slight limitation. The prosecutor violated it. Who do you think wins the next 6 objections? We do. So it all plays out to a very connected.
Jason, there's 3 levels of fingerprint analysis investigation.
Yeah, I didn't actually get to that piece, but level 1 is loops, whirls, and arches. Level 2 is looking at the points, although some people will say we look at ridge flow, which is an amorphous piece of crap. And level 3 is where they look at the width between the ridges, really sort of more microscopic, and the pores for the sweat glands. And I don't know, none of the offices maybe if someone's got the FBI, but they don't look at it. But sometimes it's in their protocols. It's the importance of all 3 levels of analysis. And you're like, you didn't even look at level 3, and that's the most specific. That's the one, the most distinguished between 2 people, even if you have a small area. And so that was a piece of the cross I forgot. Thanks.
Yeah, follow-up question, so they only need to look at 10%?
There's no number, right? So some places won't even give you a number, right? So it makes it a little bit harder. But you can do, there weren't more than 10, there weren't more than 15, there weren't more than 20. But not the IAI, not SWGFAST, not anybody has said what the percentage needs to be, or some labs used to have certain numbers. That's pretty much been phased out. Not everywhere. Some people say I need 15. Some places, like in DC, they say I need 8. I need at least 8 before I can get past the first stage, just to see if there's enough detail here to make a comparison. So I'm just looking at the latent. Is there 8? If there's 8, then I'll go and make a comparison. I guess that means that they could make a match on 8. And I don't know if this happens for you folks, this one last fingerprint thing. A lot of times they'll look at the print and they say, oh, it's of no value. You guys get some no value? So, right, the no value means that it doesn't meet their threshold of clarity or the amount of material. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't do a comparison to your client to try to get an exclusion. Right, because we have the one difference rule, and I think they're all going to give you the one difference rule. This one twist on the one difference rule is sometimes they'll say, well, sometimes the difference is just a distortion in the way the print was left. That's fine, but if it's actually if you were to look at a print of no value that had 4 points on it, and the client didn't have any of those, right, you'd have to make an exclusion. You didn't even look. Right, that's a cross, the sort of no value cross we sometimes do.
The other value I would submit in the no value, and of course as defense attorneys are going to need to be careful about this, but if there's a fingerprint on a cup that's of no value, or a table, or a gun, you can swab that and do DNA profiling on it, which could be of value, maybe to the state, maybe to you, maybe you want to test it, maybe you just want to cross out how they didn't do that. There's different forensic sciences that we can use.
Right. So that's a great point. What we have in gun cases, they try to get fingerprints off guns, and the testimony is, oh, you almost never get a fingerprint off a gun, so there's an explanation of why we don't have this nice fingerprint for you. And I don't know, some places do DNA swabbing for guns, but the arguments cross and closing is you're using a 120-year-old method with dust to try to get a fingerprint off a gun that you're only going to get 2% of the time. Or you could have just swabbed it and sent it to the DNA lab with the more modern stuff, which gives you excellent results, right? They tried the fingerprint. Why they tried the useless fingerprint as opposed to doing the DNA, which would help us all? Burden, it's on them, lack of evidence, stuff like that.
All right, well, thank you to